In this vast universe, where ancient stories have been woven through every page, there exists a mysterious world that few dare to face. It is not the world of benevolent angels or ruthless demons. No, it is the domain of ancient beings, divine. Creatures whose tales are only whispered in the sacred words of the Bible. These creatures not only represent power, but also carry eternal lessons about holiness, sin, and judgment. These beings are not the rebels of mythology or fairy tales. They are not characters you encounter in stories with happy endings. They are living symbols, born from the very will of God. They stand at the intersection of light and darkness, between divine order and primal chaos. And if you dare to open the door and step into their world, you will witness not just judgment and mystery, but the eternal battles between good and evil, between order and wildness. In this journey, you will meet Behemoth, Leviathan, Seraphim, and other creatures not from mythology, but living signs of a universe that we cannot see with the naked eye. Each of these creatures is a lesson. Each one is a warning. And each one is an indispensable part of the eternal struggle between light and darkness, between salvation and destruction. We will begin with Behemoth, the colossal creature of the earth, standing like a silent sentinel guarding the stillness of the universe. Next, we will meet Leviathan, the sea serpent with destructive power, a creature of chaos that no one can tame. We will encounter the Seraphim, beings ablaze in the light of God, and the Cherubim, the sacred guardians of his divine presence. Prepare yourself for a journey through time and space, from the pages of the Bible to our modern lives. A journey that will not only illuminate these divine creatures, but also clarify the relationship between humankind and the sacred universe. So, are you ready to step in? Let the light guide the way, and let us begin to explore these divine beings, uncovering the mysteries in the Bible that the world has long tried to forget. Behemoth, the earthbound sentinel. On the earth, where stillness reigns and unmatched strength exists only in restraint, there stands an ancient creature, firm like a guardian of nature. This creature does not destroy, does not fight, but is a living symbol of absolute stability. It is Behemoth, a colossal creature created by God to exist in peace, yet possessing enough power to make the entire universe tremble. Behemoth, described in the book of Job, is not just an ordinary beast. It is a creature beyond human imagination. With its immense body, muscles as firm as steel, and a tail long like a cedar, Behemoth is the embodiment of strength in its purest form. Though its power could easily cause mountains to tremble, Behemoth has no intention of causing harm or destruction. It simply exists, peacefully grazing under the lotus trees, where the great rivers cannot disrupt its tranquility. And this is a lesson about true power. Power does not always have to be demonstrated outwardly. Sometimes the greatest power is knowing how to restrain the urge to destroy and living in absolute steadiness. Behemoth never seeks to overpower anyone. It merely exists, an enormous presence, reminding us that there are things in this world that humans cannot control. Yet in its stillness, it compels us to look up and recognize that not all the power in the world bows to humankind. Behemoth is not just a great creature in the Bible. It is a symbol of strength with limits, of steadiness that does not need to show off. This reminds us of mythical creatures in other cultures, where the greatest power is not always shown, but rather lies in restraint and absolute calm. In Greek mythology, there are gods like Kronos and the Titans, mighty beings nearly impossible to defeat. However, instead of using their power to conquer the world, they exhibited absolute restraint. Kronos, though possessing infinite power, chose to remain silent and wait for the right time to fulfill his mission. This is a clear parallel to Behemoth. Strength does not always have to explode to impress. It can exist in stillness and order. In modern culture, the image of Behemoth can be likened to superhero characters we often see in movies. We might think of characters like Hulk, a being with boundless strength, capable of destroying everything around him when unable to control his anger. But the strange thing about Hulk is that he does not seek destruction. His power is always restrained, and when not provoked, he is just an ordinary man. Hulk's power is not for domination, but an uncontrollable strength that always exists as a reminder that in every person, no matter how powerful, there are times when restraint and self-control are necessary. Behemoth and Hulk share a common trait. Their strength is not meant to attack or conquer. Behemoth's steadiness, much like Hulk's restraint, teaches us a lesson in stillness. Both represent boundless strength, but do not manifest outwardly in ways that are easily seen or destructive. They simply exist, reminding us of accepting limits and restrained power. But Behemoth is not just a symbol in ancient mythology. In the modern world, restraint of power can be seen in those we call great leaders. People like Nelson Mandela or Mahatma Gandhi, who, though they could use their power to subdue dominating forces, chose patience and peace as their strategy. They did not use power to overwhelm, but used stillness and restraint to build a better world. We can also see this restraint in influential figures in society, such as Steve Jobs, the founder of Apple. Jobs was known for his powerful vision, yet his expression of power was not through imposition. He always found ways to restrain himself, leading people through creativity and self-control, not by direct displays of authority. Behemoth, despite its unparalleled strength, chose to live in stillness and is a symbol of restrained power. But not all creatures in this universe live in such stillness. The perfect opposite of Behemoth is Leviathan, the sea serpent, a symbol of uncontrollable chaos. While Behemoth exists in stillness, Leviathan bursts forth with destruction, embodying a force that no one can stop. To understand this contrast, we must step into the world of Leviathan, where order no longer exists and chaos reigns. Now, we will move into the next section, where Behemoth and Leviathan face off, two completely different symbols, yet deeply interconnected in the eternal struggle between light and darkness, between order and chaos. Leviathan, the serpent of chaos. In this universe where everything exists in a fragile balance, there is a colossal creature, an untamable sea serpent, carrying destruction in every movement it makes. This is Leviathan, the monster of the high seas, a creature of chaos and devastation, created by God not to be subdued, but to prove that even in the most chaotic of times, there is an ultimate power at work. Leviathan is the symbol of all that is untamable, uncontrollable. In the book of Job, it is described as a creature of immense power, with a mouth spewing fire, a body covered with scales as hard as steel, and eyes that shine like the sun. Leviathan is not an ordinary creature. It is the embodiment of chaos, of wild nature unbound by any laws. But an important thing to remember, Leviathan is not an evil monster. It is a divine being, created by God to show that even in chaos, there is the order of God. Leviathan, though carrying boundless destructive power, was not born merely to cause senseless chaos. In God's divine plan, even chaos plays a significant role. Leviathan is not only a symbol of destruction, but also a part of the cosmic system that God has created. A system in which chaos and order do not oppose each other, but in fact, they maintain a necessary relationship. In the natural world, chaos and order always exist side by side, much like storms that we cannot control but are essential for sustaining life. In this way, Leviathan is the embodiment of that storm, uncontrollable but an indispensable part of the universe's cycle. The very existence of Leviathan, with all the danger and chaos it brings, confirms that this universe is a system with divine balance. Without chaos, order cannot exist, and without order, chaos would serve no purpose. Leviathan, though carrying infinite destructive power, was not born merely to cause senseless chaos. In God's divine plan, even chaos plays a significant role. Leviathan is not only a symbol of destruction, but also a part of the cosmic system that God has created. A system in which chaos and order do not oppose each other, but in fact, they maintain a necessary relationship. In the natural world, chaos and order always exist side by side, much like storms that we cannot control but are essential for sustaining life. In this way, Leviathan is the embodiment of that storm, uncontrollable but an indispensable part of the universe's cycle. The very existence of Leviathan, with all the danger and chaos it brings, confirms that this universe is a system with divine balance. Without chaos, order cannot exist, and without order, chaos would serve no purpose. But the image of Leviathan is not confined to ancient tales. In today's society, we still encounter our own Leviathans, systems, organizations, or individuals, with so much power and influence that they become uncontrollable, causing chaos and division. Large criminal organizations, such as drug cartels or terrorist groups, are clear examples of modern Leviathans. They not only affect society through their actions, but also create unease and chaos everywhere. These organizations, despite their power and influence, cannot exist without the intervention of higher powers, just as God has promised to defeat Leviathan at the end of days. Leviathan, though not the embodiment of evil, highlights the necessity of an ultimate power to maintain order in this chaotic world. God's final judgment on Leviathan, as described in the Bible, is not merely the defeat of this creature, the affirmation of God's authority and justice. In modern society, when we face our own Leviathans, such as corrupt systems, we also await judgment, a return to order, where justice is enforced and chaos is eradicated. But even though Leviathan is a part of the cosmic system, it does not mean that humanity or God will allow that chaos to run free. Leviathan, like all the colossal and untamable creatures in mythology, will always face confrontation from divine forces. In the Bible, Leviathan is never allowed to prevail, for God is the ultimate and only authority over all creatures. In the book of Isaiah, God promises to defeat Leviathan in the final day, proving that no chaos can overcome God's justice and order. Facing Leviathan is not just a simple battle between humans and a destructive creature, but a fight between cosmic order and uncontrollable chaos. Those who fight Leviathan in mythological tales always strive to conquer not just with strength, but with patience and trust in the final justice. Just like Thor in Norse mythology when facing Jörmungandr, or St. George when fighting the dragon in Western legend, the warriors never fight by imposing direct power. They fight with perseverance and belief in a higher order which will ultimately bring victory. In modern society, confronting our Leviathans, the large forces that cause chaos and division in the community, does not always take place on a battlefield. Today's Leviathans may be totalitarian systems, criminal organizations, or political crises. They are not visible monsters, but silent forces that control, like the systems of injustice and violence. But as God promised to defeat Leviathan in the end of days, these systems will eventually face justice and change. Confronting Leviathan in this era requires patience and the ability to see the hidden truth behind all the chaos. We cannot simply impose our power to destroy these forces. Just as God created Leviathan and only He can defeat it, facing the Leviathans of society requires us to have patience, courage, and faith in a final outcome. Justice will prevail. Leviathan, in its essence, is not evil. It is a challenge, a part of God's plan to teach us the lessons of greatness and humility. Facing Leviathan, we learn not only about confronting uncontrollable forces, but also about standing firm in the storm, holding fast to our faith in ultimate justice and order. In today's world, we may not be fighting against a giant serpent, but confronting the leviathans of society, the forces of disorder and chaos, is the challenge we all must face. And just like God, those who persist and remain faithful will be the victors. But while Leviathan is a symbol of chaos and challenge, not all creatures in this universe exist in chaos. There are creatures entirely different, like the Seraphim, beings of purity and light, always beside God. They do not face destruction or chaos, but glory and worship. Let us move on to explore the holiness and purity in these creatures. Angels, who are not just messengers, but living symbols of divine light. Seraphim, the burning ones. In the highest heavens, where the presence of God shines brilliantly, there are beings who not only worship, but also carry out the divine task of purification. These are the Seraphim, fiery beings ablaze with holy flames, not to destroy, but to cleanse and purify what is unworthy, while also reflecting the infinite holiness of God. Seraphim are not messenger angels or guides like other angels. They are creatures of light and fire, always present before the throne of God, continuously praising and honoring Him. Each seraphim has 6 wings, 2 to cover their faces, 2 to cover their feet, and 2 to fly, signifying absolute respect and humility before the greatness of God. They cannot look directly at Him, but can only express their reverence through praise. Importantly, Seraphim are not just beings of light, but also purifying entities, tasked with sanctifying and cleansing what does not align with God's holiness. Seraphim are not merely noble creatures. They also play the role of agents of purification. In Isaiah 6, when the prophet Isaiah realizes his unworthiness, a seraphim takes a burning coal from the altar and touches his lips, saying, "Your guilt is taken away, and your sin is atoned for." This act is not only a physical purification, but also a symbolic washing away of sin in the soul and spirit of humanity. Seraphim are beings who not only stand in worship, but also act as agents of God, cleansing the impurities, not just from the outside, but from deep within each person. However, seraphim are not just religious creatures. Symbols of purification are present in many cultures and religions. For example, in Hinduism, we have Agni, the fire god, who has the ability to purify all evil through his sacred flames. Fire in different belief systems is not just a natural element, but a powerful tool to cleanse sin, purify the soul, and revive what is old and unworthy. Fire is a symbol of transformation, purification, and renewal. Just like the seraphim in the Bible, Agni and other fire gods carry the divine mission of cleansing and regeneration. In real life, purification does not only occur within religious beliefs. We can see the imagery of purification in social revolutions, transformative events in human history. A clear example is the French Revolution, a revolution that rejected oppression and the injustices of the old regime, ushering in a new era for society. Just as the seraphim cleanse sin and what is impure, major revolutions in history are a process of purifying a society, renewing values and structures that have become outdated and unsuitable. Similarly, the anti-corruption revolutions in modern countries, bloody protests and struggles for justice, not only bring about political change, but also a moral and cultural purification. It is like the purifying action of the seraphim. When faced with injustice, society and people need a strong purification to rebuild a foundation of fairness and holiness. Seraphim not only purify spiritually, but also symbolize significant change. not only in religions but also in modern environments and societies. In life, we must recognize that purification and change do not only occur within religious realms, but in other aspects of life. For example, in environmental reforms, where governments and social organizations fight for a cleaner, greener planet, purification is not just about environmental change, but also about changing human awareness and actions to protect Earth. Just as the Seraphim help purify the soul, environmental movements are a process of purging society from indifference and applying principles of sustainable and harmonious living. With the purification of the Seraphim, we understand that change is not just about elimination, but also about rebirth, renewal, and honoring true values. However, when purification is not enough, there are other creatures in the universe that protect the sacred values. These are the Cherubim, the guardians of God's power and glory. Let us now move forward to explore the role of the Cherubim in protecting and maintaining the holiness and justice of the universe. Cherubim, guardians of glory. Before the face of God, where power and glory reign, there exist beings who do not merely exist to worship, but also to protect the most sacred things. These beings are not messengers like angels or fiery creatures, like the Seraphim, but Cherubim, guardians of God's glory, invisible yet powerful protectors who not only preserve holiness, but also serve as symbols of justice and unconditional protection. Cherubim are not just winged creatures. They are living symbols of power and majesty, standing between heaven and earth, safeguarding the absolute holiness of God. These beings carry mystical qualities, guarding sacred spaces that humans cannot enter, representing the separation between the holy and the profane. In Genesis 3:24, after Adam and Eve were cast out of the Garden of Eden, God placed cherubim with flaming swords to guard the entrance to the tree of life, preventing them from returning. This scene is not a punishment but a symbol of protection. Cherubim guard sacred treasures, things that mankind cannot easily access without achieving the necessary purity. They are not agents of punishment, but maintain divine order and protect the noble values of the universe. Cherubim are unlike any other creatures in the universe, with 4 faces, each representing a different aspect of the universe. The face of a man symbolizes wisdom, the face of a lion represents strength, the face of an ox stands for endurance and stability, and the face of an eagle is a symbol of vision and serenity. These beings have large wings, covered with countless eyes on their bodies and wings, representing observation and endless insight, where nothing can escape the watchful eye of God. Cherubim are not just protectors, but symbols of perfection. They do not only guard sacred spaces, but also reflect the greatness of God. When one stands before them, they not only see a being of immense power, but are reminded of the existence of an eternal truth, a world in which God is the center and everything else must exist in humility and respect. Cherubim are great, powerful beings, created to protect sacred spaces where only holy beings may approach. With 4 faces and countless wings, cherubim are the embodiment of observation and infinite protection. They do not just guard sacred spaces, but also protect the divine presence of God. This image of cherubim not only represents holiness, but also safeguards the infinite power of God. In many cultures, we also find similar protective imagery as the cherubim. For example, in Greek mythology, there is Cerberus, the 3-headed dog guarding the gates of the underworld. Cerberus does not allow any soul to pass without judgment. However, unlike Cerberus, cherubim are not creatures tasked with guarding punishment, but with protecting holiness, guarding the power and glory of God from the impurities of the human world. Especially protective images in ancient cultures, such as the god Anubis in ancient Egypt, the god who protects tombs and rebirth, share similarities with cherubim in guarding sacred spaces. However, the key difference between these creatures and cherubim is their divine purpose. Cherubim do not guard life after death but protect eternal life, preserving absolute holiness. We can also perceive cherubim in a modern context, with their role in protecting sacred values in everyday life. They can be seen as symbols of justice and protection of human rights in modern political and legal systems. Human rights agencies or organizations protecting democratic freedoms can be considered modern cherubim, safeguarding holiness and justice in society, protecting the values of freedom, justice, and peace. With the protection of cherubim, we understand that not all holiness can be easily approached. There are other beings in the universe, creatures not created by God to protect order, but to disrupt it. These beings, such as the Nephilim, the offspring of unions between angels and humans, are symbols of rebellion and challenge to divine order. Let us continue our journey to explore the birth of the Nephilim and their role in the eternal battle between light and darkness. Nephilim, the fallen giants. In the vast universe of God, where everything exists in order, there is a group of beings that went beyond the boundaries of creation. They are neither angels nor humans. They are giant, powerful creatures born from forbidden unions between humans and angels. They are the Nephilim, the fallen giants, the children of the sons of God, and the daughters of men. As beings that do not belong to the human world, the Nephilim are not only a blend of two worlds, but also a symbol of defying the order that God created. Their existence is a sign of pride, a challenge to God, and ultimately the result of the greatest fall. We find the story of the Nephilim in Genesis 6:4, where the Bible says, "The sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. And when they mated with the daughters of men, their offspring became the Nephilim, mighty men of renown in ancient history." These beings were not merely strong humans. They were giants with extraordinary power, and it was this power that disrupted everything in the natural order. Nephilim are giant creatures, monuments of violation. They possessed extraordinary strength, were powerful warriors, but at the same time they were symbols of corruption. It is hard to imagine these creatures. They were great warriors, fallen deities, but not symbols of true greatness. Rather, they were symbols of breaking divine boundaries. These warriors existed in a world where the rules of God were no longer respected. However, not long after, their superiority and strength became the very cause of their downfall. The existence of the Nephilim serves as a reminder of the severe consequences of pride and breaking the boundaries set by God. The Nephilim's lack of control led them to become prey to God's judgment. And in the end, they were destroyed in the Great Flood. The Nephilim in the Bible are not the only image of strange, giant, superhuman creatures. In Greek mythology, we also encounter the Titans, great beings with superior strength, but who opposed the gods and were ultimately destroyed by Zeus and other gods. The Titans were mighty creatures, but self-destructive due to their arrogance and rebellion against the cosmic order. Like the Nephilim, they represent a violation of the cosmic order and paid a high price for their actions. In Norse mythology, there are the Jotun, or giants, who always opposed the gods, symbolizing the forces of nature and chaos. Like the Nephilim, they were not inherently good or evil, but represented an opposition to natural order. In all three of these cultures, these giant creatures represent challenges to the cosmic order and must face the final judgment. In the modern world, we no longer see Nephilim in their physical form, but there are still images of Nephilim in different forms. Powerful organizations, corrupt forces, and arrogant rulers can be seen as modern Nephilim. They possess great power, wealth, and influence, but like the Nephilim, they may break moral and societal boundaries, leading to injustice and chaos in the community. These modern Nephilim are not giants in a physical sense, but they represent a violation of order and unchecked power. But while the Nephilim symbolize violation and destruction, there are other creatures in the Bible that represent judgment and justice. The locusts of the abyss, the winged insects in the book of Revelation, symbolize punishment for sinful action, the Nephilim in the world of iniquity. As we enter the world of the locusts, we will explore God's judgment on the sinful forces that have been defeated. Locusts of the abyss, divine judgment. In all of God's creatures in the universe, there exists a group born from the deepest, darkest depths, where the darkness and judgment of God are inescapable. They are the locusts of the abyss, giant insects that bring judgment and attack, born from the abyss, carrying the punishment of God for sins and violations of the cosmic order. These creatures are not ordinary insects, but divine weapons, sent to execute the final judgment. In the book of Revelation, the locusts of the abyss appear as a sign of the apocalypse, opening the gates of the abyss, where fire and torment await. And these locusts emerge, not to destroy trees or fields, but to bring unparalleled agony to those without the mark of God. Their appearance is a warning, a declaration that when judgment comes, there will be no refuge for the wicked. These locusts of the abyss are no ordinary creatures. Each insect has a bizarre body, with a human face, horns like an ox, and wings that roar like war horses galloping. They bring fire and smoke, signs of judgment, spewing out terrifying flames. These creatures have a single mission: to inflict pain and despair on those who do not follow God, causing them to crave death, yet death will flee from them. These are not beings of physical destruction, but tools of spiritual torment, forcing humanity to face the horrific consequences of violating God. Seeing these locusts is like seeing greed, pride, and sin laid bare. Their sharp claws can easily tear through anything in their path, and their glowing red eyes pierce every corner of the human soul. These locusts are symbols of God's vengeance, when humanity, those who have abandoned justice and morality, will finally face divine punishment. However, the most terrifying aspect is their ability to cause mental anguish, an endless torment from which there is no escape, forcing the punished to live in eternal despair. The locusts of the abyss can be compared to symbols of judgment and punishment in ancient cultures. In Greek mythology, the Furies, also known as the Erinyes, are creatures sent to exact revenge for the sins committed by humans. These goddesses bring relentless torment to those who have committed great crimes, making them unable to escape the suffering of their own wrongdoings. Similarly, the locusts of the abyss in the Bible, like the Furies, are embodiments of divine vengeance, but not only to punish physically, but to make mental anguish eternal. In ancient Egyptian culture, Anubis, the god of the afterlife, also has a connection to judgment and punishment, ensuring fairness in the judgment of souls. However, the major difference is that while Anubis judges souls to determine their fate, the locusts of the abyss do not just punish but serve as divine tools of God, bringing endless pain to those who do not follow him. In modern society, when we face oppressive systems, corruption, and widespread sin, the locusts of the abyss can be seen as a symbol of the judgment these forces will face. Events like social revolutions, anti-corruption movements, or justice campaigns can be viewed as judgments against these evil powers, divine retribution for justice. These revolutions are not about physical destruction, but about punishing corrupt forces through purifying society, bringing fairness and change. With the appearance of the locusts of the abyss, we witness the final divine punishment for the wicked, an inescapable reckoning. These giant insects bring suffering and torment to humanity, representing the eternal judgment. But when judgment has been executed, when the darkness of punishment has covered the world, God does not merely observe humanity's pain, but also has other divine tools. instruments that help him carry out eternal power and absolute truth. In the eternal heights, God not only has the locusts to execute justice, but also other tools, the wheels of divine sight, the great wheels of sacred observation. These wheels are not just creatures or simple mechanisms, but symbols of eternal power, helping God to see all, understand every event in the universe without being limited by time or space. Let us now step into this great space to explore the wheels of God, the mechanisms of power and wholeness where nothing can remain hidden. The wheels of divine sight. In the eternal realm, where nothing can be hidden from the light of God, there are beings that do not merely observe, but move perpetually, following the paths of an unshakable power. These beings are not angels or guardians, but divine instruments for executing God's eternal justice. They are the wheels of divine sight, wheels that have the power to see all, witnessing every event in the universe without being bound by space or time. When Ezekiel saw the divine wheels in his vision, he did not merely see simple, lifeless objects. He witnessed a living mechanism with countless eyes on each wheel, demonstrating the absolute observation of God. These are not ordinary wheels, but part of a great system that helps God execute his power throughout the universe. In the Bible, the divine wheels are not just a physical image, but a living symbol of power and absolute observation. These wheels do not just move in physical directions, they move according to divine law, and only God understands the reasons behind their movements. These wheels move not by random chance, but they pursue eternal justice, observing everything from the past to the future. In every movement of the wheel, divine justice is executed perfectly. The wheels of God are unlike any wheels in the physical world. Each wheel has countless blinking eyes, representing the ability to see everything in the universe, every event in time and space. These wheels have no ground or sky to move through. They move along the divine path, unrestricted by time or space. When God commands, the wheels move, and when he stops, the wheels stop. They move with absolute perfection, not needing to return, but able to move in any direction, like a perpetual motion of justice. With each movement, the wheels carry divine light, and this light not only illuminates everything, but also exposes sins, dishonest actions, and reflects the wholeness of God's observation. These wheels operate not just within the universe, but also execute absolute justice. These wheels can be compared to symbols in ancient cultures. For instance, in Hindu mythology, the wheel of Brahman symbolizes the law of the universe and eternal cycles. Much like the wheels of divine sight, Brahman's wheel is not just a tool for operating the universe, but also a symbol of eternal observation. This wheel not only helps control the cycles of the world, but also executes the power of Brahman in the universe, much like the divine wheels help God execute his power and justice. In ancient Egyptian mythology, the sun wheel of Ra carries a similar meaning, symbolizing the cycle of day and night and representing eternal observation. But the major difference between Ra's wheel and the wheels of divine sight is that the divine wheels of God do not merely reflect natural laws. They are tools of absolute justice, helping maintain divine order in the universe. In the modern world, while we cannot physically see the wheels of divine sight, the image of wheels can still be related to systems of surveillance and justice in society. Legal systems, surveillance tools, or even artificial intelligence can be considered modern wheels of justice. These systems constantly monitor every action in society, recording and processing every event in life, ensuring that every action is met with justice. Like the wheels of divine sight, they help maintain fairness, monitor every action, and protect order in society. As we gain a deeper understanding of the wheels of divine sight, the unwavering observation and absolute justice of God, we realize that nothing in the universe can be hidden from his insight. However, while these wheels and divine instruments of surveillance carry out God's power, there are other living beings, other vibrant powers surrounding God who constantly worship and reflect his greatness. Let us continue our journey to explore the four living creatures surrounding God's throne, beings that not only protect but also symbolize honor and eternity. The four living creatures, guardians of eternity. Among all the creatures in the universe, there exists a group of beings born not only to protect the glory of God, but to honor his eternity. They are the four living creatures, great powers surrounding God's throne, the eternal guardians of his power and absolute holiness. These beings are not mere guards, they are living symbols of strength, wisdom, physical power, and perfect holiness. In the book of Revelation and the book of Ezekiel, we see the image of these four creatures, beings with four different faces, each representing an element in the universe. The face of a man, a lion, an ox, and an eagle not only represent physical strength, wisdom, and superior vision, but also serve as symbols of the wholeness of God's creation. These creatures do not simply live in holiness, but are born to praise God, continuously proclaiming, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come." These four living creatures, with their four different faces, wide wings, and countless eyes, are not only able to observe everything in the universe, but can move alongside God, protecting his holiness and his eternal justice. Each creature represents an aspect of the natural world and carries absolute power to execute God's justice, shielding him from any encroachment from the material world. These four living creatures are not just mighty protectors, but also symbolize the completeness of God's universe. Each creature has four faces: the face of a man, symbolizing wisdom, understanding, and perception. The face of a man represents insight and reason in the universe, the ability to see all things with superior vision. The face of a lion, symbolizing strength, courage, and power. The lion, the king of all creatures, embodies absolute authority and the ability to fight to maintain order in the universe. The face of an ox, symbolizing endurance, resilience, and diligence. The face of the ox represents unceasing strength, stability in the cosmic order. The face of an eagle, symbolizing far-sightedness, serenity, and freedom. The eagle, capable of soaring high and seeing all from above, represents superior vision and eternal light. These creatures have wide wings, covered with countless eyes, across their bodies, representing God's perfect observation. Each of their wings moves with flawless precision, never turning back, always following the path God has set for them, perfect in every movement, demonstrating absolute perfection in justice and divine power. These four living creatures can be compared to sacred protective symbols in ancient cultures. In Greek mythology, we have the heroes' guardians, mythical beings tasked with protecting sacred spaces, preserving the power of the gods. Similarly, in Norse mythology, there are the Valkyries, warrior goddesses who protect great warriors, guiding them to Valhalla, where glory and power reign. While there are similarities in their roles as protectors and guardians, the four living creatures in the Bible have an absolute power and sanctity that cannot be compared to any creatures in these cultures. In the modern world, the four living creatures can be related to symbols of justice and power in society. These creatures can represent the systems that protect rights, justice, and holiness in the world, much like the current legal and law enforcement systems protect fairness and order in our society. The wheels of justice in society are not only tools of surveillance, but also protect sacred values, ensuring that every action conforms to moral rules and eternal justice. With the absolute protection of the four living creatures, we recognize that the order and justice of the universe are maintained perfectly. But while these creatures protect holiness and justice, there are forces opposed to God, creatures that bring chaos and sin into the universe. Let us continue our journey to explore the dragon, the enemy of heaven, a creature that brings betrayal and rebellion against God's divine power. The dragon, the enemy of heaven. When looking into the mysteries of the universe, we see that there are not only creatures that protect the holiness and justice of God, but also opposing forces, malevolent beings born from darkness and rebellion. They do not merely challenge the order of God, but provoke him with the aim of disrupting everything he has created. They are the dragon, the enemy of heaven, a creature of chaos and betrayal. In the book of Revelation, the dragon is depicted as a bringer of downfall, a symbol of sin and rebellion. It is not just a monster that can be easily defeated, but a colossal force, representing the most powerful opposition to God and the cosmic order. The dragon is not merely an intruder, but an invisible force spreading sin, seeking to destroy everything that God has made. In Revelation 12:3, the dragon is described as having 7 heads and 10 horns, with 7 crowns on its heads. This image is not just of a massive creature, but a symbol of power and rebellion. Each head of the dragon represents a form of power it holds in the world of sin. The horns and crowns represent the forces of evil, wicked nations, and the sinful leaders it controls. But it is not only the dragon's power that makes it a symbol of endless destruction. Its brutality and malice do not just bring physical devastation, but also disrupt the spiritual and moral order in the world. The dragon's provocation of God has created an ongoing battle in the universe, where heaven and hell must face each other. The dragon is a giant creature with 6 wings, a dark hue covering its body. Its red eyes burn like fire, and its hot breath sends waves of heat, making the surrounding space dark and menacing. Each of its heads symbolizes a force of power, and each crown represents a kingdom it rules. It can sweep away 1/3 of the stars in heaven, a warning of its strength and unpredictable danger. The dragon is the enemy of all holiness, not only fighting against God, but also against the prosperity of light. It is a symbol of betrayal, provocation, and fear, always seeking to invade the universe, to create chaos and destroy everything that God has made. In Greek mythology, we have the image of Typhon, a gigantic monster with boundless strength, a symbol of chaos and destruction in nature. Like the dragon, Typhon represents rebellion against the gods, bringing storms and destruction. However, the difference between Typhon and the dragon is that while Typhon is a symbol of natural chaos, the dragon represents spiritual opposition and betrayal against God's divine order. In ancient Egyptian mythology, there is the image of Apep, the monstrous serpent of chaos, who opposed Ra, the sun god. Apep is not only a powerful monster, but also a symbol of evil and destruction. Like the dragon, Apep tries to darken everything, corrupting wisdom and light, defiling everything Ra represents. In modern society, we cannot help but relate the dragon to the forces of evil present in the world. Corrupt individuals, wicked organizations, and authoritarian powers can be seen as embodiments of the dragon in our world. They hold power and seek to oppress, manipulate society, disrupt order and justice. Like the dragon, these forces use their power to create chaos and violate fairness. With the appearance of the dragon, the eternal enemy of God, we realize that while the powers of darkness always seek to invade, God will always maintain justice and the cosmic order. And when the world sinks into chaos, there are creatures that will appear to bring the final judgment. Let us continue our journey, to explore the four horsemen of the apocalypse, creatures carrying destruction and the final end of all evil and sin. The four horsemen, the riders of the apocalypse. In the universe, where justice and sin are in a constant clash, there are colossal beings that emerge as the final moment approaches. These beings are not just warriors or angels, but the horsemen of the apocalypse, the harbingers of the final judgment. They do not come to save, but to bring destruction and end the arrogance of humanity. They are the four horsemen, the riders of the apocalypse, bringing death, war, famine, and plague. When the Lamb opens the four seals in the book of Revelation, the four horsemen appear, each riding a different horse, bringing terrible events that no one can avoid. Each horseman is a symbol of destruction in the universe, and each of their horses carries a message of unstoppable devastation. These riders not only bring physical destruction, but also symbolize despair and the eternal end for the sinful forces of the world. The first rider, riding a white horse, carries a bow and a crown. With the appearance of this rider, war and conquest begin. His bow is not just a weapon of war, but a symbol of invasion and brutality. This rider comes not only to fight, but to make humanity conquer one another, to exploit and break the peace of the world. The second rider, riding a red horse, holds a sword. This is the symbol of war, bringing division and violence between nations. The presence of this rider signals the destruction of peace and the rise of bloodshed, plunging the world into endless conflict. His sword is not just a weapon, but the blade that cuts through all truth, creating deep wounds in the heart of the world. The third rider, riding a black horse, holds a scale. This rider brings famine and injustice, and his scale symbolizes the failure of fairness. In his hands is a measure of scarcity, where wheat and oil will become luxuries for many, while the sinners continue to enjoy abundance. This is the symbol of social injustice, where the poor must pay the price for the greed of the powerful. The fourth rider, riding a pale horse, brings with him a scythe and death. He is the symbol of disease, plague, and destruction. Each step he takes is a step toward death, a manifestation of uncontrolled chaos. He will sweep through the world, bringing disease and death to those who are too weak to resist. With each rider, we realize that destruction is inevitable. No one can escape their judgment. No nation or individual can hide when God's judgment arrives. They are not merely the harbingers of the end of time, but symbols of the conclusion of a generation, the end of the old world. Each rider carries unique traits, but is united in one common purpose: to bring total destruction. All four horsemen symbolize judgment and the end, not only bringing physical destruction, but also representing the collapse of the order that God has created. The first rider, riding the white horse, is the conqueror, but his victory is not the victory of justice, but of greed and invasion. The second rider, riding the red horse, is the bringer of war, bringing division and conflict. The third rider, riding the black horse, brings famine, symbolizing injustice and the destruction of fundamental values. Finally, the fourth rider, riding the pale horse, brings death and disease and inevitable destruction. The four horsemen are not the only image of judgment in ancient cultures. In Greek mythology, there are the Furies, the goddesses of vengeance who bring pain to the guilty. In Norse mythology, Fenrir, the giant wolf, is also a symbol of the disruption of order and ultimate destruction. However, the difference between these figures and the four horsemen in Revelation is that the four horsemen are not just creatures of punishment, but divine instruments of God executing eternal justice. In the modern world, we can see images of the four horsemen in the societal upheavals we face. War and political conflict are represented by the second rider. famine, and social injustice are embodied by the third rider. Plague and the moral decay of society reflect the influence of the fourth rider. These crises are signs of inevitable judgment and messages of permanent change in our world. Conclusion: the eternal battle between order and chaos. The eternal battle between order and chaos has existed since the dawn of the universe. When God created this world, He not only crafted a perfect universe, but also established fundamental principles: justice, holiness, and order. But within the darkness of that creation, there have always been opposing forces, rebels and chaos, that constantly challenge and break that order. The struggle between light and darkness, between order and chaos, is an ongoing tale that never ends. The four horsemen of the apocalypse, the dragon, and the forces of chaos are but symbols of the eternal conflicts in the universe, where every creature must face an important choice: maintain order or step into chaos. God, with all His power and justice, preserves His holiness and constantly seeks to bring humanity back to divine order. He not only observes all things from on high, but also intervenes directly through protective beings like the Cherubim and Seraphim, and instruments of justice like the wheels of divine sight. But it is humanity with its free will that must face this choice. Sin, ambition, and pride are always powerful temptations, and while God continues to protect and maintain order, chaos always seeks to invade, leading humanity toward the abyss of destruction. This battle is not only fought in the catastrophic moments of the apocalypse, but is a continuous fight in each day, in every action we take. When we face temptations, when we confront the choice between justice and sin, we are contributing to that eternal struggle. Every decision we make, whether small or large, is a part of the battle between order and chaos, between light and darkness. God has given us free will, but this freedom is not the freedom to disrupt the cosmic order. Instead, it is the freedom to choose the path of justice, holiness, and peace. We can pursue order, or we can choose to sink into chaos, to walk the path that rebels and sinners have tread. But remember, ultimate justice will prevail. When all the forces of chaos have been tested and judged, when the four horsemen have brought destruction, and the dragon has darkened the world, God will remain steadfast. Divine order will endure forever. Every action, whether sinful or just, will eventually be condemned or rewarded, and the protective beings, the eternal powers, such as the Cherubim and Seraphim, will continue their mission to guard the holiness and justice of God. This battle will never end, but we can be the victors in the battle between order and chaos. As long as we continue to walk the path of justice, steadfast in faith and obedience to God, we will be recognized and protected. And when all is said and done, when the battle between light and darkness is over, justice will triumph eternally. Every being will stand before God in reverence and will realize that in this great battle, only God is the final victor.